Beneath the boathouse floorboards, the veteran found something Ethan had hidden carefully enough to survive years of winter ice and silence. The flashlight shook slightly in Walter's hand as Ranger stood frozen beside the loose boathouse planks, ears forward, staring at the dark space underneath. Cold wind rolled across the lake. Somewhere out on the ice, something cracked loud enough to echo through the trees. Walter slowly pulled the hidden metal box into the light and realized his brother had never meant for this cabin to be sold at all. What would you have done after opening that box? The probate office sat above a pharmacy on a narrow street in downtown Toledo. Outside, late November rain streaked across the windows in crooked lines. Cars hissed through wet intersections. Somewhere below, a delivery truck backed up with a long electronic beep that made Walter Hayes glance toward the door. Before he realized where he was, old habit. At 72, some habit stayed buried in the bones. The office itself was too warm. The radiator near the wall clicked every few seconds like loose metal, settling after a hard winter. Walter noticed it immediately. He noticed the air vent above the bookshelf, too, the narrow hallway behind him, the angle of the frosted glass door leading to the stairs. He always did. Ranger lay beside his chair with his front paws crossed neatly on the carpet. The German shepherd's thick coat still carried traces of rain from outside. One ear twitched every time the radiator knocked. Walter rested a hand lightly against the dog's neck. Easy boy. Across the table sat Claire Hayes and her husband, Doug. Claire wore a cream-colored coat that still looked new enough to hold store creases near the sleeves. Doug scrolled through his phone until Claire nudged his arm without looking at him. Neither of them had said much since Walter walked in. That was fine with him. The funeral had been 3 days earlier. Small, quiet. Ethan never liked crowds. Walter had stood through the service listening to people describe his older brother as dependable, generous, steady, all true. Yet none of them had seen Ethan during the bad nights near the end. The oxygen tank, the shaking hands, the weeks when Walter slept in a recliner beside the hospital bed because Ethan hated waking up alone. That part belonged to Walter. Attorney Richard Bell cleared his throat and opened the folder in front of him. Thank you for coming in this afternoon. The papers made a dry sliding sound against the desk. Ranger lifted his head slightly. Walter looked toward the rain outside instead of at Claire. To Claire Hayes, the attorney continued, the family farmhouse property located outside Perrysburg, including all agricultural acreage and attached structures. Claire nodded once, not surprised. Walter felt nothing at first, just the warmth pressing against his face from the radiator. The attorney continued reading. Savings accounts, farm equipment, insurance funds, Ethan's truck, the house itself. Doug finally leaned back in his chair, satisfied in the quiet way people get when life confirms what they already expected. Walter kept his face still. His brother's watch went to Claire. The woodworking tools went to Doug. Even the old fishing boat Ethan rebuilt 15 years ago had already been assigned. Walter's name never came. Ranger shifted closer until his shoulder rested against Walter's boot. The radiator clicked again. Walter stared at the bookshelf behind the attorney. Tax manuals, estate binders, a framed University of Michigan diploma hanging slightly crooked on the wall. Anything but Claire's expression. Finally, Richard Bell adjusted his glasses. There is one remaining property. Doug stopped tapping his foot. A cabin parcel located in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan near Blackwood Lake. Walter frowned faintly. Ethan still owned that place? He had not heard his brother mention the cabin in years. The attorney glanced down at the paperwork. That property transfers to Walter Hoyes, including attached workshop structures and lake access rights. Current assessed market value is considered limited due to location and seasonal accessibility. Limited, not worthless, but close enough. Doug let out a quiet breath through his nose. Claire looked over for the first time all afternoon. "The cabin?" she asked. "Seriously?" The attorney simply nodded. Walter said nothing. In his mind, he could suddenly see the place again. Pine trees bending over dark water, rusted dock posts, a long gravel road buried in snow half the year. Ethan used to take him fishing there decades ago before the war, before everything split apart into separate lives. Claire crossed one leg over the other. "I didn't even know Uncle Walter still liked going up there." "I don't," Walter answered quietly. His own voice sounded rough from disuse. Doug leaned forward. "Honestly, the property's probably more trouble than it's worth. Pipes freeze up every winter." Ethan mentioned that once. Walter looked at him without speaking. Doug shifted back slightly. Richard Bell continued through the final legal language. Signatures, processing timelines, county transfer paperwork. The words blurred together after that. Walter noticed Ranger before he noticed himself trembling. Just a little. The dog had lifted his head fully now, amber eyes fixed on Walter's hands. Walter curled them into fists beneath the table. Not here, not in front of them. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the city. The meeting ended without ceremony. Claire stood first. "We'll need to figure out what to do with the garage soon," she said while gathering her purse. "There's still a lot of your stuff from helping Dad. Helping Dad." Walter almost laughed at that. For 8 months he had cooked meals in Ethan's kitchen, cleaned medical equipment, handled prescriptions, slept in hell chairs, and watched a strong man disappear piece by piece, helping. "Take your time," Richard Bell said gently. Walter nodded once. Ranger stood immediately beside him. The dog moved close enough that his shoulder pressed against Walter's thigh as they walked toward the hallway. Claire's voice followed behind them. "If you decide to sell the cabin, Doug knows a realtor up there." Walter paused near the doorway but did not turn around. "I haven't decided anything." Claire hesitated. "Well, winter hits hard up there, so I remember." Then he left. Cold rain hit his face the second he stepped outside. Ranger walked beside him through the parking lot without pulling on the leash. Walter breathed easier out there. Cars moved through the wet streets. Tires hissed across pavement. A siren wailed somewhere far downtown. Normal sounds, manageable sounds. He stopped beside Ethan's old Chevy pickup parked near the curb. Claire must have driven it over after the funeral. Ranger suddenly froze. The dog's ears lifted forward. "What is it?" Ranger moved toward the passenger side and lowered his nose near the back window. Inside the truck sat an old storage crate covered with a canvas tarp. The dog sniffed once, then again. Longer this time. Walter frowned. Rainwater dripped steadily from the brim of his kappa. Traffic lights reflected red across the wet pavement behind them. "Ranger." The dog did not move right away. For a few seconds he simply stared through the glass at the covered crate inside Ethan's truck, as if trying to place a scent he almost remembered. Then Walter's phone buzzed in his coat pocket. A text from Claire. "Let us know when you're ready to clear out the garage." Walter read the message once, then slipped the phone away without answering. Beside him, Ranger finally stepped back from the truck. But even as they walked toward Walter's old Ford parked across the street, the dog kept glancing over his shoulder toward Ethan's pickup and whatever sat hidden beneath that canvas tarp. Walter noticed. He noticed everything. Rain tapped softly against his jacket while he unlocked the truck. Ranger jumped into the passenger seat instead of the back, like he usually did after long days. The dog settled heavily against the worn bench seat, still watching the street through the fogged window. Walter started the engine. The heater coughed twice before warm air pushed through the vents. Downtown Toledo slid past in gray streaks, wet brick buildings, traffic lights reflecting on pavement. A woman dragging grocery bags through the rain, with her head down against the wind. Normal life. Walter kept both hands tight on the wheel. At a red light, he caught himself checking the mirrors again. Rear view, side street, pedestrians near the crosswalk. Old habits. Ranger rested his chin near Walter's elbow. "You're staring holes through me," Walter muttered. One ear twitched. That night, Walter barely slept. He sat in Ethan's garage, surrounded by half-packed boxes, while the old fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Dust floated through the narrow beam above the workbench. Ethan's tools still hung neatly on pegboards exactly where he left them. Wrenches sorted by size. Extension cords coiled tight. Coffee can full of loose bolts. Walter stared at them for a long time. The garage smelled like motor oil and cold concrete. Familiar smells, safer than hospitals. Ranger slept near the side door at first. Then, sometime after midnight, the dog stood and walked slowly toward Ethan's old fishing crate, sitting beneath the workbench, the same crate from the pickup. Walter frowned. "What's in there?" Ranger sniffed along the edge once, then looked back at him. Walter finally pulled the tarp aside. Inside sat old lake maps, 2 rusted tackle boxes, and a faded photograph folded in half. Walter picked it up carefully. Ethan stood beside a small cabin near dark water, younger by 20 years at least. Pine trees behind him, snow piled against a crooked dock railing. Walter recognized the place immediately. Blackwood Lake. On the back, Ethan had written only 3 words, "Still holding together." Walter stared at the handwriting for a long moment. Then he folded the picture again and slipped it into his coat pocket. By sunrise, he had made up his mind. He loaded the truck in silence. A duffel bag, his old military toolbox, winter clothes, Ranger's bed. 2 rifles locked in hard cases behind the seat, untouched for years, except during deer season. Nothing more. There was not much left that felt worth carrying anyway. The sky was pale when they crossed into Michigan. Snow patches still clung to shaded ditches along the highway. Bare trees stretched for miles beside the road like black veins against the morning fog. Ranger stayed awake the entire drive. Most dogs would have slept. Not him. Every so often he lifted his head toward passing trucks before settling again. Walter drove north for hours without turning on the radio. Silence suited him better. Near Lansing, a transport truck roared past close enough to rattle the Ford's windows. For half a second, Walter's chest tightened hard. Rotor wash, heat, dust blowing sideways across sandbags. His fingers locked around the steering wheel before he could stop them. Ranger immediately pushed his nose against Walter's arm. Walter blinked once. The highway returned. Cold sky, asphalt, pines, no helicopters. He exhaled slowly. "Getting too old for this," he muttered. But his heartbeat stayed uneven for another 10 miles. By evening, they stopped at a roadside motel outside Green Bay. The neon vacancy sign flickered weakly against the dark. The woman behind the desk barely looked up from her crossword puzzle. "Room 12, she said, sliding over the key. The room smelled faintly of old coffee and bleach. Ranger walked the perimeter once before settling near the door. Walter sat heavily on the edge of the bed. His knees hurt more lately. Cold weather made it worse. Outside, trucks growled down the highway all night long. Sleep came in short pieces. At 2:17 a.m., Walter woke instantly after hearing metal clang somewhere outside. He was standing before he fully realized it, pulse hammering, eyes searching the dark motel room. Ranger stood too, silent, alert. Walter listened. A dumpster lid somewhere near the parking lot banged once in the wind. That was all. Still, he stayed awake another hour, staring through the curtains at the highway lights. By morning, snow had started falling lightly. The Upper Peninsula felt different the farther north they drove. Smaller towns, longer empty stretches between gas stations, frozen rivers hidden behind thick woods. The world narrowed down to road, trees, and sky. Walter stopped once near a roadside diner outside Marquette. Ranger waited beside the truck while Walter carried out eggs and black coffee in a paper bag. A young cashier nodded toward the dog. Beautiful shepherd. Walter glanced back toward Ranger. "Yeah," he said quietly. "He is." The girl smiled. "Looks like he watches over you." Walter didn't answer right away. Then he looked down at the coffee, warming his hands. "Most days," he admitted. By late afternoon, the highway gave way to smaller county roads lined with heavy pine forest. Snow thickened along the shoulders. Ice cracked softly beneath the truck tires whenever Walter drifted too close to the edge. Blackwood Lake appeared on a faded wooden sign nearly buried in snow. 5 miles. Walter felt something shift low in his stomach. Not fear, exactly. Something older. Ranger stood abruptly before the truck even turned onto the narrow gravel road leading toward the lake. His ears lifted forward, low sound in his throat, not barking, warning. Walter slowed the truck. Tall pines crowded both sides of the road now. Snow-covered branches leaned overhead so tightly they blocked most of the fading daylight. Then Walter saw it. The lake. Dark, steel-colored water beneath a frozen shoreline. And beyond it, half hidden through the trees, sat the cabin Ethan had left behind. Ranger's growl deepened softly as he stared past the cabin toward an old boathouse near the water's edge. Walter followed the dog's gaze. Something about that place felt awake, not abandoned. Waiting, Walter shut off the engine. But neither he nor Ranger moved right away. The ticking of the cooling truck filled the silence. Outside, wind pushed across the frozen shoreline in long, cold breaths. Snow drifted between the trees. The cabin sat maybe 50 yards from the water, dark against the fading sky. Ranger's eyes stayed locked on the boathouse. "What do you see?" Walter asked quietly. The dog gave no answer except another low rumble deep in his chest. Walter finally opened the truck door. Cold air hit hard enough to sting his lungs. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he stepped out. Ranger jumped down beside him immediately and began scanning the property in slow circles. Not frantic, methodical. Walter knew that behavior. The cabin looked smaller than he remembered. Time had pressed inward on it. The roof sagged slightly, near one corner. One gutter hung loose. But the windows were intact, and fresh wood had been stacked neatly beneath a tarp beside the porch. Somebody had been here recently. Walter climbed the porch steps carefully. The old boards groaned beneath his weight but held firm. He unlocked the front door. The smell inside stopped him for a second. Dust, cedar, cold iron. Old smoke trapped deep in wood, not rot, not ruin. The cabin felt closed up for winter, not abandoned for years. Ranger entered first. His nails clicked softly across the wooden floor while he moved room to room checking corners and shadows. Walter watched him disappear briefly down a short hallway before returning to the main room. The furniture was old but solid. A wool blanket folded neatly over the couch, cast iron stove near the center wall. Fishing books stacked beside a cracked leather chair. Walter set his duffel near the door. "You kept coming up here," he muttered under his breath, as if Ethan might answer. He walked toward the kitchen area. Dry goods still sat in the cabinet. Canned soup, coffee tins, matches sealed in plastic bags. Enough to tell him Ethan planned ahead. Enough to tell him Ethan expected to come back. Ranger suddenly paused near the rear window. His ears lifted again. Walter stepped beside him and looked out. The boathouse sat closer to the shoreline than he remembered. Half its roof was covered in snow. One side leaned slightly toward the lake. Beside it stood a narrow workshop building, with faded blue paint peeling from the siding. Something about the place bothered him. Not danger, exactly. Presence. The kind you feel before you can explain it. By the time Walter got the stove going, darkness had settled fully over Blackwood Lake. The fire cracked softly while snow brushed against the windows. Ranger still had not fully relaxed. Every few minutes the dog wandered to the front window or back door before returning to the stove. "You're acting like we've got company." Walter sat heavily in the leather chair and rubbed both hands near the heat. His body ached from the drive north, his knees, his shoulders. Even his jaw felt tight. The war had left pieces behind in places doctors never found. Later, unable to sleep, Walter stepped outside with a flashlight. The lake stretched black beneath the moonlight. Thin ice near the shoreline shifted with faint cracking sounds. Pines swayed overhead. Ranger stayed close against his leg. Walter walked slowly toward the boathouse. The snow near the entrance looked disturbed. Not fresh footprints exactly. More like compressed patches where boots had passed recently before the latest snowfall. He crouched lower, old instincts again. The padlock hanging from the boathouse door was newer than the cabin lock. Walter frowned. Why replace this and not the others? Ranger sniffed along the lower edge of the door, then glanced toward the workshop building nearby. Walter followed. The workshop smelled faintly of gasoline and sawdust even before he opened it. Inside sat shelves packed with tools, engine parts, clamps, and old marine batteries. A workbench stretched along one wall beneath hanging shop lights. Walter slowly moved the flashlight beam across the room. Everything looked used, not museum clean, recent clean. One wrench still carried grease stains that had not fully dried into rust. Walter touched it with his thumb. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Not anger, not grief either. Confusion. He opened a cabinet and found labeled coffee cans filled with screws, bolts, spark plugs. Ethan's handwriting covered masking tape strips along the shelves. Dock hardware, fuel line parts, starter rebuild kit. Walter stared at the labels longer than he meant to. Ethan hated organizing anything when they were younger. Said labels were for librarians and nervous people, but these shelves were meticulous. Ranger moved deeper into the workshop and stopped near a side table covered with faded papers. Walter walked over. Most were weather reports, fuel receipts, supply orders. Then he spotted a handwritten note pinned beneath a heavy wrench. Winter dock inspection. Ask Ben about south pilings before thaw. No date. Just enough to pull Walter deeper into questions he did not want. The next morning, the snow stopped. Gray light spread slowly across the lake while Walter drank burnt coffee from an old enamel mug. Ranger sat near the window watching the shoreline. By mid-morning, Walter drove into the nearest town. Blackwood was little more than one main road wrapped around the lake. A gas station, small grocery store, hardware shop, 2 churches, and near the marina, a faded sign reading Novak Marine Repair. Walter parked outside. A bell jingled overhead when he entered. Warm air and engine grease hit him immediately. An older man looked up from behind a counter, cluttered with carburetor parts. White beard, heavy flannel jacket, thick glasses sliding low on his nose. The man studied Walter for half a second. Then his expression shifted. "You're Ethan's brother, not a question." Walter nodded once. The man wiped his hands on a rag and came around the counter. "Ben Novak," he said. "Haven't seen you since, hell, maybe the 90s. Walter shook his hand. "You knew Ethan came up here." Ben gave him a strange look. "Came up here?" He almost laughed softly. "Your brother was here all the time." Walter felt something tighten behind his ribs. "All the time?" "Every month or so. Sometimes longer." Ben nodded toward the lake outside. "Said somebody had to keep the place running." Walter glanced toward the marina through the frosted windows. "Running for who?" Ben hesitated, just enough for Walter to notice. "For the town mostly," he said finally. "For the shoreline." That answer only deepened the confusion. Walter folded his arms. He never mentioned any of this. Ben looked genuinely surprised by that. "Huh." Silence settled between them. Somewhere in the garage behind the shop, metal clanged sharply. Walter's shoulders stiffened before he caught himself. Ben noticed. Didn't comment. Ranger sat beside Walter's leg, perfectly still, watching the room. Finally, Ben nodded toward the dog. "That shepherd yours?" "Yeah. Good animal." Walter scratched lightly behind Ranger's ears. "He thinks something's off at the cabin." Ben's eyes flickered briefly toward the lake, then away again. "Maybe he's smarter than both of us," he muttered. Walter caught the change in his tone immediately, and for the first time since arriving at Blackwood Lake, he realized the cabin might not be the only thing Ethan had left behind. That night, long after the town lights disappeared behind the trees, Walter woke suddenly to the sharp sound of metal striking metal somewhere outside near the shoreline. Ranger was already standing at the cabin door before Walter even opened his eyes. The dog's body looked rigid in the dim firelight, ears forward, head low. Walter sat up slowly in the recliner beside the stove. For one confused second, the darkness and the sharp metallic sound dragged him somewhere else entirely. Tin roofs, rotor blades, night watch rotations. Then the cabin returned around him. Cold air leaked through the old windows. Embers glowed faint red inside the stove. Wind moved softly through the pines outside. Walter reached for the flashlight beside the chair. "Easy," he whispered. Ranger glanced back once but stayed near the door. The sound came again. Clang. Closer this time. Walter pulled on his boots and heavy coat without turning on the overhead lights. Old habits again. Light made you visible. The porch boards groaned under his weight as he stepped outside. The lake stretched black beneath a thin layer of drifting fog. Ice near the shoreline cracked softly, in slow, uneven lines. Walter swept the flashlight beam toward the boathouse. Nothing. Then the wind shifted. A loose metal chain hanging beside the dock struck one of the posts again. Clang. Walter exhaled quietly. Ranger moved ahead first anyway, inspecting the shoreline. As if he didn't fully trust the explanation, neither did Walter. The snow around the boathouse looked disturbed again. Not fresh footprints exactly, but enough to keep his nerves awake. He crouched beside the dock posts. One section had been repaired recently. Different bolts, cleaner wood grain. Somebody had maintained this place, long after Ethan stopped talking about it. Ranger wandered toward the workshop and stopped beside the side entrance. His nose hovered near the lower crack beneath the door. Walter unlocked it. Cold air and machine oil drifted out. The workshop looked different at night. Shadows stretched long across the walls. Hanging tools swayed faintly whenever the wind hit the building. Walter walked slowly between the workbenches. Then he saw it. One section of flooring near the back wall carried newer wood than the rest. Not brand new, but replaced within the last few years. Ranger pawed lightly near the edge once. Walter knelt down and ran his fingers across the seam between the boards, solid but newer. "Ethan," he muttered under his breath. "What were you doing up here, Ranger?" Continued sniffing while Walter searched the nearby shelves. Most held ordinary things: boat varnish, rope, fuel stabilizer, sandpaper. Then he opened a lower cabinet near the bench. Inside sat 3 thick ledgers stacked neatly together. Walter carried them to the work table beneath the hanging light. The first notebook was filled with repair records: boat engines, dock repairs, snowmobile carburetors. Most entries ended with amounts crossed out or marked paid later. Some simply read no charge. Walter frowned. He turned another page. Fuel pump rebuilt for Jensen families before freeze, no charge. Dock repair after storm damage, covered by Ethan. Another page. Starter motor rebuilt. Student apprenticeship project. Walter stared at that line for several seconds. Student apprenticeship? Ranger settled beside the bench while Walter kept reading. Names repeated throughout the ledger. Families. Small repair jobs. Supplies purchased in town. Notes about weather damage and shoreline cleanup. None of it looked like business. It looked personal. Community work. Near the back of the final ledger, Walter found pages written in different handwriting, younger handwriting. Learning ignition timing today. Thanks for letting me use the tools. Another page. Mr. Hayes said, measure twice before cutting anything. Walter leaned back slowly in the chair. The workshop suddenly felt smaller around him. His brother had built something here. Not money, not some hidden empire, something quieter. The next morning, Walter drove back into town, carrying one of the ledgers beneath his arm. Snow clouds hung low over Blackwood Lake. Smoke curled from chimneys along Main Street. Ranger stayed close beside him as they entered the small diner near the marina. Warm air and frying bacon wrapped around them instantly. Several people glanced toward Walter with the cautious curiosity small towns reserved for outsiders. Ben Novak sat in the corner booth drinking coffee. "You look like hell," Ben said as Walter approached. "Didn't sleep much." Ben noticed the ledger immediately. His expression changed. "So you found those?" Walter slid into the booth across from him. What exactly was Ethan doing up here? Ben stirred his coffee slowly before answering. Trying to keep the shoreline from turning into another tourist strip. Walter waited. Ben nodded toward the ledger. Workshops started small. Kids needing somewhere to learn repairs. Folks around here needing help fixing things they couldn't afford replacing. He never mentioned any of it. Ethan wasn't much for speeches. Neither were they. A waitress refilled Ben's coffee without asking. Ranger lay beside Walter's booth, calm but watchful. Ben lowered his voice slightly. Maria Torres helped him a lot with the apprenticeship stuff. "Who's that?" "High school shop teacher." As if summoned by the name, the diner bell jingled behind them. A woman in her 40s stepped inside, brushing snow from her coat sleeves. Dark hair tied back, tired eyes, practical boots. Ben raised a hand. "Maria." She walked over and stopped when she saw Walter. For a second, she studied his face carefully. "You're Ethan's brother." Walter nodded once. Maria smiled sadly. "He talked about you sometimes." That surprised him more than it should have. She slid into the booth beside Ben. "When kids around here were getting into trouble, Ethan opened the workshop Saturdays," she explained. "Engines, woodworking, welding basics, gave them somewhere else to be." Walter looked down at the ledger again. "He did all this alone?" "Mostly." Maria shrugged lightly. "People helped where they could." Walter rubbed his thumb along the notebook edge. The more he learned, the less the will made sense. Why leave him this place and say nothing? Why keep all of it hidden? His phone buzzed suddenly against the table. Claire. Walter stared at the screen before answering. What? Claire's voice came sharp through static. Doug talked to a realtor in Marquette. If you want to unload the cabin before spring, now's the time. Walter looked through the diner window toward the frozen lake beyond town. I just got here. That place is falling apart, Walter. He glanced down at Ranger, lying quietly beside the booth. No, he said slowly. It isn't. Claire sighed heavily. You don't understand what upkeep costs on property like that. Walter almost laughed at the irony. For months he had cleaned Ethan's wounds, measured medications, paid utility bills, fixed leaking pipes. Now suddenly they thought he couldn't handle a cabin. I'll let you know, he said. Then he hung up before she could answer. Silence settled over the booth again. Maria exchanged a look with Ben. Walter noticed. You both know something you're not saying. Ben stared into his coffee for a long moment. Then Ranger stood abruptly beside the booth. The dog's ears lifted toward the diner windows facing the lake. Outside, snow drifted across the parking lot, and parked near the Marina Road sat a dark SUV Walter had never seen before. The engine idled for several seconds, then slowly drove away. Walter watched the SUV disappear behind the falling snow until only the taillights remained visible through the trees. Beside him, Ranger stayed standing near the diner window, still alert. Maria noticed. That dog always this serious? She asked quietly. Walter pulled his eyes from the road outside, usually for a reason. Ben leaned back in the booth with a tired sigh. You're gonna start hearing names around town soon, he said. People notice new vehicles this time of year. Walter folded the ledger shut. That connected to Ethan? Neither Ben nor Maria answered right away. That silence told him enough. By late afternoon, the snow had thickened into heavy gray sheets, drifting across Blackwood Lake. Walter drove back toward the cabin slowly while Ranger sat upright beside him watching the road. The workshop lights stayed dark when they arrived. No tracks near the buildings except their own. Still, Walter checked anyway. Old instincts never cared whether fear looked reasonable. The boathouse creaked softly under the wind as he unlocked it. Ranger immediately moved inside ahead of him and began circling the floor again. Not random, focused. Walter swept the flashlight across the room. Fuel cans, rope hooks, workbench. Nothing moved. But Ranger stopped near the newer section of flooring again and lowered his nose to the boards. Walter crouched beside him. The dog pawed once near the seam, not scratching, pointing. You really don't like this spot, Walter muttered. He tapped the wood with the flashlight handle. Solid, then slightly hollow near the center. Walter froze. He tapped again. The sound changed. His eyes narrowed. The replacement boards sat tighter than the others. But now that he looked closely, one carried faint scrape marks near the screws. Recently opened or closed. Ranger stepped back and sat down, watching him carefully. Walter walked to the tool wall and grabbed a screwdriver. The metal squealed softly as he loosened the first screw. Then the second. Cold wind pushed against the side of the boathouse while snow rattled lightly across the roof overhead. Walter lifted the board carefully. Beneath it sat a shallow storage hatch lined with weatherproof plastic. Not large. Maybe 3 feet across. Practical. The kind of hidden storage people in lake country sometimes built for documents or emergency supplies during harsh winters. Inside rested a sealed metal container wrapped in canvas. Walter stared down at it for several seconds. Ranger leaned closer but did not touch it. Walter finally lifted the container out and carried it onto the workbench. The latch stuck at first from the cold, then gave way. Inside were folded maps, rolled documents, and a stack of old mini-DV tapes bundled together with rubber bands gone brittle from age. No cash, no secret fortune, just paperwork. Walter unfolded the first map across the workbench. Blackwood shoreline, dock access points, boat launch easements, property boundaries marked in careful red ink. He frowned. The second folder held signed community agreements dating back nearly 15 years. Shared shoreline use, dock repair cooperation, fishing access rights for local residents. Ethan's name appeared repeatedly. So did several others Walter recognized from town. Ben Novak, Maria Torres, families from the ledger. Walter rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw. What the hell were you mixed up in? He reached for one of the tapes next. A note written in Ethan's handwriting sat attached to the side. If something happens to me, watch these first. Walter's stomach tightened. The cabin still had electricity, barely. After 20 frustrating minutes searching through dusty shelves and tangled cords, he finally found an old camcorder inside a storage cabinet. Ranger stayed beside the workbench the entire time. Watching, waiting. Walter inserted the tape. Static flickered across the small screen. Then Ethan appeared. Older than the photograph Walter found in Toledo, but healthier than the man from the hospital bed. He stood outside the workshop, wearing a heavy coat and knit cap, while snow blew behind him across the lake. He looked tired, but steady. "If you're watching this," Ethan said into the camera. Then I probably ran out of time explaining things proper. Walter sank slowly into the nearby chair. Ethan glanced off-screen briefly before continuing. Blackwood's changing, has been for years. He rubbed his gloved hands together against the cold. Developers started buying shoreline south of the lake around 2010. Resorts, vacation rentals, bigger marinas. The camera shifted slightly as if Ethan had set it down on a toolbox. Folks around here can't compete with money like that. So we built agreements instead. Walter listened without moving. Shared access rights, easements, dock use protections. Ethan nodded toward the frozen shoreline behind him. Not glamorous, but enough to slow people down. Wind crackled through the camera microphone. The cabin itself ain't worth much, Ethan continued. But this section of shoreline connects 3 public access routes and the old workshop property. Walter looked down at the maps spread across the table. Suddenly, pieces started fitting together. "This place matters because it keeps the lake open," Ethan said quietly. "Once it's sold off, piece by piece, it doesn't come back." The video paused briefly as Ethan adjusted the camera again. Then his expression softened slightly. Walter always understood how to hold a line. Walter's chest tightened unexpectedly. "He won't like any of this," Ethan admitted with the faintest, tired smile. "Probably curse me for dragging him into it. But he's the only person I know who won't sell the place just because somebody waves money around." The screen flickered. Then the tape ended. Silence filled the workshop again, except for the wind outside. Walter sat motionless for a long time. Ranger rested his head quietly against Walter's knee. Not comfort exactly. Presence. Walter stared at the frozen image, left on the tiny screen. All this time he thought Ethan had pushed him aside, written him out. But sitting there in the cold workshop, with shoreline maps spread around him, and his brother's voice still hanging in the air. The humiliation from Toledo started changing shape into something heavier. Responsibility. Outside, headlights suddenly swept across the boathouse windows. Walter stood instantly. Ranger was already moving toward the door. A dark SUV rolled slowly past the cabin road beyond the trees. Same shape. Same black paint. The vehicle never stopped. just kept moving along the shoreline before disappearing into the snowfall again. Walter watched until the lights vanished completely. Then he looked back at the maps on the table. For the first time since Ethan died, Walter understood one thing clearly. The cabin had never been the burden. It was the reason people kept coming back. Walter barely slept after that realization settled into him. The wind battered the cabin through most of the night. Ice shifted along the shoreline with low groaning sounds that rolled across the lake like distant thunder. Ranger stayed near the front window until dawn, watching the road through narrow gaps in the curtains. By morning, the storm had passed. Cold sunlight spread across Blackwood Lake in pale silver bands. Snow clung to the dock posts and the roof of the boathouse. Smoke rose from chimneys farther down the shoreline. Walter stood at the kitchen counter, holding Ethan's maps again. Shared access routes, community easements, public launch protections. Nothing flashy, nothing worth millions. Just enough legal weight to stop somebody from fencing off the shoreline and turning the lake into private property. Ranger rested beside the stove, though every few minutes his ears twitched toward the road outside. Walter noticed that too. "You expecting company now?" The dog lifted his head but stayed still. Walter spent the morning in the workshop. For the first time since arriving, he stopped looking at the place like temporary shelter. He started seeing what needed fixing. Loose hinges, cracked wiring, rust creeping across the vice mount near the workbench. He tightened bolts on one of the marina carts while snowmelt dripped steadily from the roof outside. Simple work, useful work, the kind that kept his hands busy enough to quiet everything else. Near noon, Ranger stood abruptly. A vehicle approached from the road. Not fast, careful. Walter stepped outside, wiping grease from his hands with an old rag. The black SUV rolled into the clearing slowly before stopping near the porch. Claire climbed out first. She looked uncomfortable the second. Her boots touched the snow. Behind her emerged a tall man in an expensive dark coat, carrying leather gloves and polished winter boots completely wrong for the mud around the lake. Ranger moved beside Walter immediately. Silent, alert, Claire forced a small smile. "Walter." Walter said nothing. The man stepped forward first. "Dean Mercer," he said, extending a hand. "North Shore Development Group." Walter glanced at the hand but didn't take it. Dean recovered smoothly enough. "We appreciate you meeting with us." "I didn't agree to any meeting." Claire sighed softly. "Walter, please. We drove 6 hours." Ranger's eyes stayed fixed on Dean, not aggressive, reading him. Walter folded the rag into his pocket. "What do you want?" Dean looked toward the lake behind the cabin. "Beautiful property," he said. "A lot of potential here." Walter almost smiled at the word. Potential. That usually meant somebody planned to erase what already existed. Dean continued carefully. "We've been working with several landowners around Blackwood. Long-term tourism development, upgraded marina access, seasonal lodging, resort," Walter said flatly. Dean nodded once. "In practical terms, yes." Claire stepped closer. "Walter, this isn't some shady deal. Ethan was stubborn about this place for years, but the town's changing." Walter looked at her. "You knew about the shoreline agreements?" "Some of it. How much?" Claire hesitated just long enough. Dean stepped in smoothly. "Your brother understood the lake carried economic value." "No," Walter replied quietly. "He understood people lived here." For the first time, Dean's expression tightened slightly. Cold wind swept through the clearing. Ranger moved half a step closer to Walter's side. Dean removed a folder from beneath his coat. "We're prepared to offer a very fair price for your section of shoreline and workshop rights." especially considering the maintenance costs involved. Walter didn't touch the folder. Folks around here need jobs, Claire added quickly. Businesses are barely surviving through winter anymore. Walter looked toward the frozen lake, then toward the workshop. He thought about the ledger entries. No charge. Covered by Ethan. Apprenticeship project. You think Ethan didn't know that? Walter asked. Claire rubbed both gloved hands together against the cold. He wouldn't listen to anybody near the end. Something in Walter hardened at that. Near the end. As if Ethan had simply become difficult instead of dying. Dean finally lowered the folder. Mr. Hayes, I understand this is emotional. But realistically, one aging workshop and a few access agreements won't stop progress forever. Walter's eyes lifted slowly. There it was. Not anger. Dismissal. The same quiet way people looked at old men and small towns once they decided both belonged to the past. Ranger stepped forward then. Not growling. Not baring teeth. Just placing himself between Walter and Dean with calm, steady certainty. Dean stopped talking immediately. Walter rested one hand lightly against the dog's neck. He's friendly, Walter said. Usually. Dean cleared his throat. We're simply trying to avoid unnecessary conflict later. Walter studied him carefully. Military habit again. Read posture first, tone second. Dean wasn't a bully. He was worse in some ways. A man completely certain the outcome already belonged to him. Walter glanced down at the folder still tucked beneath Dean's arm. You been buying shoreline all around the lake? Some parcels. And Ethan wouldn't sell. Dean said nothing. That silence answered enough. Claire stepped closer again. You don't even live here, Walter. The words landed harder than she intended. Walter looked around slowly. The cabin, the workshop, the frozen lake beyond the trees. Then he looked back at her. Maybe I do now. Claire blinked. For a second, genuine confusion crossed her face, as if the possibility had never occurred to her. Dean tried once more. We're offering stability, financial security. That building behind you won't survive another 10 winters. Walter turned toward the workshop. Weathered blue paint, crooked gutters, smoke stains near the roofline. Maybe Dean was right. Maybe the place would eventually collapse anyway. But suddenly that didn't feel like the point. My brother built something here, Walter said quietly. Dean nodded politely. And we respect that. No, Walter replied. You respect the shoreline. Silence settled heavily between them. Wind rattled the loose chain near the dock. Finally, Walter stepped back toward the porch. I'm not signing anything. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Walter? I said no. Ranger never moved from his place between Walter and the visitors. Dean studied the dog one last time before slipping the folder back into his coat. This conversation isn't finished, he said calmly. Walter met his eyes. Wasn't planning on it being. The SUV backed slowly out of the clearing a few minutes later. Snow cracked beneath the tires. Walter stood watching until the road disappeared behind the trees again. Only then did Ranger finally relax. The dog leaned lightly against Walter's leg. Walter scratched behind his ears absently while staring across the lake. He had come north expecting abandonment. Instead, he'd walked straight into a fight Ethan had been holding off for years. And somehow, without asking permission, the lake had already started pulling him into it. That night, Walter slept lightly in the recliner, beside the stove. Not because of the cold, because of the feeling that somebody might come back. Ranger stayed awake longer than usual, too. Every creak from the trees pulled one ear upright. Every passing gust across the lake made him lift his head. Around 3 in the morning, Walter woke suddenly. Silence. Real silence. That bothered him more than noise ever had. He sat still in the darkness listening. Then he heard it. A faint scrape outside near the workshop. Ranger was already standing. Walter grabbed the flashlight and the heavy wrench leaning beside the stove before stepping onto the porch. Snow had hardened overnight into brittle crust beneath his boots. The moon hung pale above the lake, casting silver light across the shoreline. The workshop door stood half open. Walter stopped moving instantly. His breathing slowed. His shoulders tightened. Old training sliding back into place before he could stop it. Ranger moved ahead carefully, silent as shadow. Walter pushed the workshop door wider with the wrench. The beam from his flashlight swept across the room. Nothing moved, no intruder, no broken windows. But several drawers near the workbench had been pulled open. Tools scattered across the floor. One of the shoreline maps missing from the table. Walter lowered the flashlight slowly. Ranger sniffed along the concrete floor near the rear entrance. Fresh boot scent. Recent. Walter rubbed one hand across his jaw. They're looking for paperwork. The realization settled cold inside him. Not random vandalism. Somebody knew exactly what mattered here. The next morning, Ben Novak arrived before sunrise carrying a thermos of coffee and 2 replacement hinges for the workshop door. Walter hadn't called him. Apparently, word traveled fast around Blackwood. Ben crouched beside the damaged lock and sighed. Figured this might happen eventually. Walter leaned against the wall with folded arms. You knew somebody'd come snooping around? Ben tightened one screw carefully before answering. Ethan worried about it near the end. Walter looked toward the lake. Why not just tell people what was going on, Ben? Snorted softly. Because folks hear development money and start making decisions fast. That sounded true enough. Ranger wandered the shoreline while they worked. Every so often he stopped near the dock and scanned the trees before continuing. Ben noticed. That dog misses nothing. He's old, Walter replied. Makes him suspicious. Ben laughed quietly. So are we. Later that afternoon, Walter drove with Ben along the southern shoreline to inspect several dock posts mentioned in Ethan's notes. The lake looked different during daylight now, less abandoned, more lived in. Small cabins tucked between pines, fishing shacks near frozen inlets, smoke rising from chimneys. People still holding on to pieces of the place. At one narrow shoreline access point, Walter noticed fresh survey stakes pushed into the snow. Bright orange ribbon fluttered from them. Ben's expression darkened immediately. Those weren't here last week. Walter crouched beside one marker. Numbers stamped along the plastic-matched property survey codes. Dean Mercer's people were already measuring, testing boundaries. Ranger sniffed the stake once, then sneezed sharply and backed away. Walter pulled the marker from the ground. Ben watched him carefully. You know that won't stop anything. No, Walter replied, but it sends a message. By the following weekend, Walter found himself spending more time at the workshop than inside the cabin. Word spread quietly through town that Ethan's brother knew engines. Then people started showing up. First, a teenager named Lucas with a busted snowmobile carburetor. Then 2 brothers needing help repairing dock winches before spring thaw. Walter almost told them no, almost. But fixing things came easier than conversations. Ranger adapted faster than Walter did. The dog became part of the workshop immediately. He lay near the stove while the boys worked, occasionally lifting his head whenever tools clattered too loudly. One afternoon, Lucas tied a red shop rag loosely around Ranger's collar and called him floor supervisor. Walter expected the dog to hate it. Instead, Ranger simply sighed and kept watching everybody like tired management. The workshop slowly filled with sounds Walter hadn't heard around himself in years. Laughter. Arguments about tools. Country radio humming low in the background. Young voices asking questions. He found himself teaching without planning to. "No, not like that," he muttered while correcting Luca's grip on a socket wrench. "You strip the bolt, you own the mistake." The kid grinned. "Yes, sir." Walter paused slightly at the word sir. Nobody had called him that outside a VA clinic in years. Later that evening, after everyone left, Walter stayed behind cleaning the bench while Ranger dozed beside the heater. That was when he found the envelope. It had slipped behind one of the old manuals near the back shelf. Plain white, no stamp. His name written across the front in Ethan's handwriting. Walter, nothing else. His chest tightened immediately. He opened it slowly. Inside sat several folded pages. The paper looked worn from handling, as if Ethan had started and stopped writing it more than once. Walter leaned against the bench and began reading. "You disappeared after the war, longer than anybody knew how to reach you." The words hit harder than he expected. Not because they were cruel, because they were true. The letter continued in Ethan's steady, uneven handwriting. "Mom thought giving you space would help. Dad pretended not to notice. I figured eventually you'd get tired of running from everybody." Walter swallowed slowly. Outside, wind rattled the boathouse chain against the dock again. Ranger lifted his head but stayed near the stove. There were stretches in the letter Walter barely remembered clearly anymore. Months sleeping in his truck after the divorce. Too much whiskey. Too many nights waking up somewhere without remembering how he got there. Ethan wrote about all of it plainly. No judgment. Just memory. Then came the line that stopped Walter cold. "I bought this place because I thought someday you might need somewhere quiet enough to come back to yourself." Walter stared at the sentence for a long time. The workshop suddenly felt too warm, too small. He sat heavily in the chair beside the workbench. For years, he'd convinced himself the family stopped trying because they didn't care. Now, he wondered how many times he'd pushed them away before they finally ran out of ways to reach him. Ranger crossed the room slowly and rested his head against Walter's knee. Walter rubbed behind the dog's ears absent-mindedly while staring at the letter. "You knew before I did, huh?" Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor. Outside, somewhere across the frozen lake, ice cracked softly beneath the first slow signs of thaw. Walter stayed in the workshop long after dark, with Ethan's letter spread open beside the lamp. The building smelled of sawdust, cold metal, and coffee gone stale hours ago. Wind brushed softly against the siding while Ranger slept near the stove. But Walter couldn't settle, not after reading those words. "I thought someday you might need somewhere quiet enough to come back to yourself." He read the line 3 more times. Every time it landed differently. For years, Walter had carried the same story inside his head. Ethan stayed close to the family. Walter drifted away. That was just how life worked after war. Simple. Clean. Except now it didn't feel simple anymore. Now it felt like Ethan had spent years quietly leaving doors unlocked in case Walter ever found his way back. Walter folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket before shutting off the workshop lights. The lake groaned again in the darkness. Not violent anymore. Changing. The next few days passed slower. Snow softened around the shoreline. Water appeared beneath the dock ice in narrow dark ribbons. The town started talking about spring repairs. Walter found himself helping without meaning to. One afternoon, he repaired a broken trailer hitch for Harold Jensen down near the marina. Another morning, he spent 2 hours teaching Lucas how to rebuild a small outboard motor without stripping the housing bolts. The work felt steady, predictable, safer than memory. Ranger followed him everywhere. Kids from town greeted the dog before they greeted Walter now. Somebody tied another rag around his collar, this one blue. Ranger tolerated the attention with exhausted dignity. Walter almost smiled watching it. Almost. Then Claire showed up again. This time she came alone. No SUV, no Dean Mercer. Just Claire driving Ethan's old pickup through slushy shoreline roads, late one afternoon while rain tapped against the windshield. Walter spotted the truck from inside the workshop. Ranger stood immediately, but his reaction felt different this time. Cautious, not defensive. Claire climbed out slowly, wearing jeans, boots, and Ethan's old brown jacket. The sleeves hung slightly too long on her arms. She looked tired. Not angry, just worn thin. Walter wiped grease from his hands with a rag. "You get lost?" Claire glanced around the workshop before answering. "This place looks different. Been fixing things." "Yeah." She nodded faintly. "I can see that." Silence settled awkwardly between them. Rain drummed softly against the metal roof overhead. Finally, Claire shoved both hands into her jacket pockets. "I wasn't honest before." Walter waited. She looked toward the lake instead of him. "Doug and I are behind on the mortgage." Walter said nothing. The hardware store barely survived winter. Medical bills stacked up after Ethan got sick. She swallowed hard. When Dean started talking numbers, it sounded like a way out. For the first time since Toledo, Walter saw something besides entitlement in her. Fear, the ordinary kind. The kind people carried quietly until money turned every conversation sharp. Claire rubbed at her eyes quickly before continuing. "I thought Ethan was being stubborn. I thought he cared more about this place than the family." Walter leaned against the workbench. "He cared about both." She nodded once. "Yeah, I think I know that now." Ranger crossed the workshop slowly and sat beside Claire without touching her. She looked down at him and managed a tired smile. "He always liked you better than me." Walter snorted softly. "He likes people who stop talking eventually." That earned the first real laugh he'd heard from her. Small, but real. Rain kept falling harder outside. Claire walked slowly through the workshop afterward, touching tools and shelves like she was seeing them for the first time. "He built all this?" she asked quietly. "Not alone." Walter nodded toward the repaired engines lined along the wall. "Town helped." Claire stopped beside the old bulletin board near the back corner. Photographs covered it. Teenagers holding fish beside repaired boats. Winter dock repairs. Summer cookouts near the shoreline. Ethan appeared in many of them. Never centered, always working in the background. Claire stared at one photo for a long moment. "I didn't know." "No," Walter replied gently. "Neither did I." Ranger suddenly lifted his paw sharply. Walter looked down instantly. A thin line of blood streaked across the concrete floor. Claire gasped softly. "Ranger." The dog had stepped onto a jagged strip of rusted metal hidden beneath a tarp pile near the wall. Walter moved fast, too fast. His pulse slammed hard against his ribs, while old panic surged up his spine before he could control it. "Easy," he muttered, already kneeling beside the dog. Ranger stayed still, though his ears flattened slightly. Walter's hands shook while inspecting the paw. Not deep, just a slice across one pad. But the sight of blood hit something raw inside him. Images flashed before he could stop them. Field bandages, dark sand, somebody screaming for a medic through radio static. Walter blinked hard. The workshop disappeared for half a second. Then Ranger nudged his arm lightly with his nose, grounding him. Claire crouched beside them carefully. "It's small," she said softly. "He's okay." Walter nodded once, but kept pressure against the towel wrapped around the paw. His breathing stayed uneven longer than he wanted. An hour later, they sat inside the small veterinary clinic near town while rain hammered the windows outside. The veterinarian, an older woman named Dr. Keene, cleaned the cut and wrapped Ranger's paw with practiced ease. "He'll milk this injury for sympathy," she warned. Walter rested one hand against Ranger's neck. "He already does, Doctor." Keene smiled faintly. Outside the exam room, Claire waited beside the vending machines, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. She handed one to Walter when he stepped out. "You care about him a lot," she said quietly. Walter stared into the coffee. "He's the only thing that stuck around when things got bad." Claire looked down the hallway. "I think Ethan hoped this place might do the same thing." The words settled deep, not because they were dramatic, because they sounded true. When they returned to the cabin that evening, the rain had stopped completely. Fog drifted low across Blackwood Lake, while meltwater trickled beneath the thinning ice. Ranger limped slightly as he crossed the porch. Walter watched him carefully the entire time. Too carefully. Inside the cabin, Walter dried the dog's fur with an old towel while the stove crackled nearby. Then his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Unknown number. He almost ignored it. Instead, he answered. A woman's voice came through, carefully hesitant. "Walter?" He froze. It took him several seconds to recognize his own daughter's voice after so many years. Before he could answer, the line crackled, then disconnected. Walter stood motionless beside the stove, holding the silent phone, while Ranger rested his bandaged paw across Walter's boot. Outside, somewhere beyond the dark shoreline, the lake ice shifted again beneath the first real signs of spring. He did not call the number back that night, or the next morning. The phone stayed face down on the kitchen table, while Walter buried himself in work around the workshop and shoreline docks. That was easier. Wood and engines made sense. People didn't. Spring kept pushing forward anyway. Snow retreated from the roads first. Then patches of brown grass appeared beneath the trees. Meltwater streamed beneath the dock planks in cold, rushing lines. Blackwood Lake looked restless now, caught between seasons. Ranger's paw healed quickly, though Walter still watched him too closely whenever the dog stepped off the porch or crossed rough ground. The workshop stayed busy. Too busy, honestly. By mid-March, people passed through almost daily. Dock repairs, small engine rebuilds, welding jobs Ethan used to handle quietly himself. Walter found himself slipping into routines before realizing it. Coffee at dawn. Workshop stove by 7. Kids arriving after school. Ranger supervising everything from the warmest spot near the heater. One afternoon, Ben Novak walked in carrying folded papers beneath his arm. His expression alone told Walter something had shifted. "The council scheduled the shoreline vote," Ben said. Walter set down the carburetor he'd been rebuilding. "When?" "Friday night. Too soon." Walter wiped his hands slowly with an old rag. Ben leaned against the bench. "Dean's been talking hard around town, promising marina upgrades, seasonal jobs, tourism money." Walter nodded once. He understood the argument. Places like Blackwood survived winter one paycheck at a time. Hopes dead different when bills stacked high enough. Ben studied him carefully. "You planning to speak?" Walter almost laughed. "I spent 20 years avoiding rooms full of people." "Yeah," Ben replied quietly. "But Ethan figured you would eventually stop running." That landed harder than Walter wanted. By Friday evening, the town hall beside the marina was packed tighter than Walter had expected. Folding chairs filled every corner. Wet boots tracked slush across the floor. Coats steamed lightly from melting snow near the heaters. Voices bounced sharply off the old wooden walls. Too many voices. Walter felt it immediately. The noise, the shifting bodies. Too many exits to monitor at once. Ranger stayed pressed close against his leg as they entered. The dog sensed it before anyone else could. Walter's shoulders tightening, his breathing shortening. Dean Mercer stood near the front, beside several printed development boards, showing bright illustrations of future lakeside cabins and marina expansions. Everything looked polished, expensive. Almost nothing looked like Blackwood anymore. Claire sat near the middle rows, twisting her gloves nervously between both hands. When she spotted Walter, she gave a small, uncertain nod. He returned it, barely. The meeting dragged at first. Town council members reading procedures, budget estimates, survey reports. Walter heard maybe half of it. His attention kept drifting toward exits, windows, sudden movements in the crowd. Old wiring in his brain refusing to quiet down. Ranger eventually lowered himself across Walter's boots. Heavy, steady, grounding him again. Dean spoke for nearly 20 minutes. Confident voice, calm posture. He talked about jobs first, then tourism revenue, then infrastructure improvements. Blackwood has an opportunity to grow, he said smoothly. Without investment, communities like this slowly disappear. Several people nodded. Walter understood why. Dean wasn't lying exactly. That made it harder. When public comments finally opened, silence settled heavily over the room. Nobody wanted to go first. Then Maria stood. This town already survives because people help each other, she said. Because somebody from downstate promises vacation homes. A few scattered claps followed. Ben spoke next about public shoreline access and fishing rights. Then Harold Jensen talked about repair costs families already struggled to afford. The room divided quietly, not enemies, neighbors, that somehow felt worse. Finally, one council member looked toward Walter near the back wall. Mr. Hayes? Walter froze. Every eye in the room shifted toward him. Instantly, his pulse jumped hard enough to hurt. Ranger stood beside him immediately. Walter hated public speaking before the war. Afterward, it became almost impossible. Too many faces, too much silence waiting for words. He nearly sat back down. Then he remembered Ethan standing alone on those old videotapes, talking into a cheap camera because nobody else would. Walter rose slowly. The room blurred slightly at the edges while he walked toward the front. Ranger stayed him the entire way. Walter stopped near the podium, but never touched it. His hands remained buried in his jacket pockets. For several seconds, he said nothing at all. The silence stretched awkwardly. Then he looked toward the back windows facing the lake. My brother wasn't trying to stop progress, Walter said quietly. The room settled. He just didn't want this place turned into something people here couldn't afford anymore. Dean shifted slightly near the council table. Walter continued. I've spent most of my life leaving places before they could matter too much. He glanced down briefly at Ranger beside him. Probably got good at it. A few people exchanged looks. Walter swallowed once before continuing. But Ethan stayed. His voice roughened slightly there. He fixed docks, taught kids engine work, helped people keep boats running another season when they couldn't afford replacements. Walter looked around the crowded hall slowly. This workshop by the lake? He nodded toward Ben and Maria. It matters because folks use it. Same with the shoreline. Still no grand speech, no dramatic moment. Just truth spoken plainly. If you sell every quiet place to the highest bidder. Walter finished softly. Eventually people stopped belonging anywhere. Silence followed. Real silence. Then Claire stood unexpectedly near the center row. Walter looked at her in surprise. She cleared her throat nervously. I wanted the development deal at first, she admitted. I thought Ethan was being unreasonable. Dean's jaw tightened. Claire kept going anyway. But I was wrong about what he built out there. The room listened carefully now. My uncle's right, she said quietly. The workshop already helps people. I've seen it. Walter stared at her. For the first time since Toledo, she looked less like opposition and more like family again. The final vote took nearly another hour. Arguments continued. Numbers got debated. Tension climbed higher each time somebody mentioned jobs or taxes. In the end, the shoreline easement protections survived by only 3 votes. 3. No applause followed. Just long, exhausted silence while people absorbed what came next. Not victory exactly. Only delay. But delay mattered. Outside the town hall, wet snow drifted through cold spring rain, while people slowly dispersed into the parking lot. Dean passed Walter near the steps. "This isn't over," he said quietly. Walter nodded once. "I know." Dean studied him for another second before walking away into the dark. Claire lingered beside Ethan's old pickup afterward. Ranger leaned lightly against Walter's leg while water dripped steadily from the roof gutters overhead. Claire reached into her coat pocket and held out a small brass key. Walter frowned. "What's this?" "Garage side door," she said softly. "There's one thing Ethan never showed anyone." Walter stared at the key resting in her palm while rain rippled across the dark parking lot around them. Then slowly he reached for it. The brass felt cold against his fingers. Claire pulled her coat tighter around herself and glanced toward the marina lights across the road. "He kept the garage locked after he got sick," she said quietly. "Said he wasn't ready yet." Walter nodded once. Neither of them spoke much during the drive back to Toledo 2 days later. Rain followed them most of the way south. Ranger slept across the backseat seat. At first, his bandaged paw resting awkwardly against Walter's old army blanket. But every so often, the dog lifted his head and watched the highway slide past, through fogged windows. The garage sat behind Ethan's empty house exactly as Walter remembered it. Same faded siding, same basketball hoop leaning crooked over the driveway. The world had shifted around it anyway. Walter unlocked the side door slowly. Dust and cold air drifted out. Claire reached for the light switch. The overhead bulbs flickered once before warming the room in pale yellow. For a moment, Walter simply stood there. Ethan's old canoe rested upside down from ceiling hooks. Shelves overflowed with tackle boxes, fuel cans, old tools, extension cords, ordinary things. Then Walter noticed the photographs, hundreds of them, pinned across corkboards lining the back wall. Blackwood Lake through every season imaginable. Summer cookouts beside the dock. Kids holding rebuilt engines beside the workshop. Winter shoreline repairs under floodlights. Neighbors gathered around bonfires near the frozen marina. Walter stepped closer slowly. In nearly every photograph, Ethan stood somewhere in the background, never posing, always working. Ranger wandered the garage quietly while Walter moved from picture to picture. There was Lucas grinning beside his first rebuilt outboard motor. Maria teaching 2 teenagers how to sand boat panels. Ben Novak covered in grease beside a broken dock lift. Whole years of small moments Walter had never seen. No grand legacy, no empire. Just evidence that Ethan had spent 15 years helping a place stay alive, one repair at a time. Claire stood beside him, staring at the wall. "He never showed us any of this." Walter swallowed slowly. "No," he said, "I don't think he built it to be seen." Near the back shelf, Walter found several old binders stacked beneath a tarp. Inside were workshop schedules, supply lists, handwritten notes from parents thanking Ethan for helping their kids learn trade skills. One letter simply read, Thank you for giving Caleb somewhere to be after his dad passed. Walter sat heavily on the old stool near the workbench. His chest hurt in that quiet, heavy way grief sometimes returned when nobody expected it. Not sharp anymore, just deep. Ranger crossed the garage and rested his head against Walter's knee. Walter scratched behind the dog's ears absent-mindedly. He was busy while I was disappearing. Claire looked down at the floor. You were hurting. So was he. Silence settled softly around them. Outside, spring rain tapped steadily against the roof. Back at Blackwood Lake, the ice finally began breaking apart for real. Not cracking anymore. Breaking. Whole sheets drifted slowly away from shore, beneath pale morning sunlight. Walter stood at the end of the dock, watching the water move freely for the first time since arriving. Ranger sat beside him, fur lifting gently in the cold breeze. The bandage was gone now. Only a faint limp remained. Behind them, the workshop doors stood open. Voices echoed from inside. Lucas arguing about spark plugs. Ben complaining about tool organization. Maria laughing at both of them. Life. Walter still wasn't fully used to hearing it around himself. The town council officially approved temporary community management of the workshop 2 weeks after the vote. Nobody made a ceremony out of it. Ben simply handed Walter a clipboard one morning and said, "Guess you're running things now." Walter almost refused. Then Ranger wandered past, carrying somebody's dropped work glove in his mouth, while 3 teenagers chased after him, laughing. Walter looked around the workshop. The repaired benches, the organized shelves, the old stove glowing warm against the back wall. Then he took the clipboard. Spring spread across Blackwood quickly. After that, snow vanished from the shoreline. Boats returned to the marina one by one. Meltwater rushed beneath the docks, carrying broken ice into open lake water. Walter found himself staying busy from sunrise until dark most days. And for the first time in years, the quiet inside his head no longer felt empty. One evening near sunset, he sat alone on the dock cleaning old fishing lures, while Ranger rested beside him. Loons called somewhere across the water. The sound carried clean through the cool evening air. Walter's phone buzzed softly in his jacket pocket. Unknown number again. He stared at it for several seconds. Ranger lifted his head, watching him. Walter answered this time. "Hello?" Silence. Then his daughter's voice returned carefully through the line. "Dad?" Walter closed his eyes briefly. The lake moved softly against the dock below him. "I'm here," he said. His voice sounded rougher than he intended. Neither of them knew exactly what came next. That was all right. Some things repaired slowly. After the call ended, Walter stayed on the dock a while longer, watching the last broken slabs of shoreline. Ice drift apart into open water. Ranger leaned heavily against his side. Warm, steady. Walter looked toward the workshop lights glowing through the trees behind them, then toward the wide, dark lake stretching beyond the horizon. He thought back to that overheated probate office in Toledo. The radiator clicking beside strangers, reading Ethan's will aloud while Walter sat there, believing his name had been erased. But Ethan hadn't erased him. He had trusted him. Trusted him to hold the line a little longer, to keep one decent place from disappearing. Walter rested one hand against Ranger's neck while the final pieces of winter drifted quietly away from shore. Some people spend years believing they were left behind because nobody wanted them anymore. Sometimes the truth is smaller than that, and kinder. Sometimes somebody simply leaves you the one place where they believe you still might belong. The lake rippled softly beneath the fading spring light. Beside him, Ranger watched the open water without moving, and for the first time in a very long while, Walter did not feel like a man standing outside his own life, looking in. Maybe that was the real thing Ethan left behind. Not the cabin, not the shoreline, not even the workshop. He left Walter a reason to stay connected to people again. A reason to wake up needed. And sometimes, for people who have spent years carrying grief, guilt, or silence, that matters more than money ever could. What makes this story hit so hard is that nobody saved Walter with a speech. There was no perfect ending, no magic moment that erased the war, the distance, or the years he lost hiding from the world. Healing came slowly, through work, through trust, through a stubborn old dog who refused to leave his side, and through small acts of care that reminded Walter he still belonged somewhere. A lot of people grow older, feeling invisible, especially veterans, especially people carrying wounds nobody can see. Sometimes all it takes is one person, or one loyal dog, to keep them from disappearing completely. If this story meant something to you, let me know down in the comments. Type 1 if you believe loyalty can change a person's life. Or type 0 if you think some wounds never fully heal. And if you'd like to hear more quiet stories about second chances, loyal dogs, and people finding their way back to life one small step at a time, you're welcome to stay with us for the next one.